Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Theory Poems and Paintings. Today is day 125, so we're continuing with our D-verbals, right? First we did verbal adverbs, which were fairly simple. Then on day 124 we covered verbal adjectives, active, right? And we saw that there are quite a variety of verbal adjectives. And so today we're continuing with verbal adjectives. Now we're tackling the passive forms, for which there are present and past, right? So sort of like yesterday we had active verbal adjectives, present and past. Today we have the same thing, only passive. And we'll see that today the first batch, the present passive forms are actually very easy to form. Also, maybe the least frequently seen of all the D-verbals we're looking at in this unit. But the second variety today, the past passives, are both the most difficult to form and the most commonly used, even in speech, I would say. So it just has to work out that way, right? Because this is Russian, right? So anyway, but we'll deal with it. It's actually not too difficult, but there are quite a few things to keep in mind, especially with certain verbs, right? In terms of how they form their past passive participles, or as we'll call them, PPPs for short. Okay, if we look at a painting called Prival Restantov, again, kind of one of these shocking realist paintings that's supposed to depict injustice and maybe rouse us to indignation, right, and to hopefully some sort of political change. Anyway, в этой страшной картине мы видим группу людей, идущих по пустынной дороге где-то в степи и провожаемых жандармами. Okay, so we have two D-verbals here, verbal adjectives, right? In this terrible, horrible painting, or frightful painting, we see a group of people who are underway, right, along a bleak path, right, somewhere out in the wilderness. Pustynная дорога is some kind of path through the empty wilderness or desert. Где-то в степи и провожаемых жандармами. Okay, so провожаемый, that is the first type of D-verbal we'll see today. That's present passive. It means who is being accompanied, right? So we don't know this verb, but it means to accompany. It means who are these people? They're underway, right? Present active, on foot, and they are being accompanied, right? So present passive, they are being accompanied by gendarmes, right? By armed guards, right? And note that the gendarmerie is in the instrumental. So we're going to see that a lot with passive verbal adjectives, just like with pretty much any passive construction, right? You can get the instrumental to tell you by what, or with what, by whom something is being done, right? Passively. Это группа арестованных и сосланных в Сибирь. Okay, these are both PPPs, right? So PPPs will translate into English pretty nicely as ED participles, right? So these are people who, this is a group of people who have been arrested and exiled, right? Арестованный would mean arrested, сосланный, exiled, Sibir, right? Exiled to Siberia. Скорее всего, на так называемую каторжную работу или каторгу, right? Most likely, they've been sentenced to so-called, that which is called or that which is named, right? Называемый, так называемый, that's another present passive form, right? They've been sentenced to what's known as so-called каторжная работа, or simply каторга, which was the name for this forced labor out in Siberia. И провожающих их жен и детей, right? So this is also a group not only of the arrestees, but the convicts, but the women and children who are accompanying them, right? Here we see провожающий, that's a present active verbal adjective, right? Who are accompanying. Мы видим одного жандарма, открывшего глаз умирающего. We see one guard who has opened, right? That's past active, right? Открывшего, who has opened the eye of an умирающего, right? Of a man who is dying. That's present active. Или, скорее всего, уже умершего арестанта. Or, now look at the shift in aspect, right? Not more likely, not one who is умирающий, but умерший, right? One who has already died, perfective. Right, so it's hard to tell. This man may still be dying, or maybe he's already died, right? More than likely, right? We can't be sure. Арестанта лежащего на телеге, right? Lying on a cart or a wagon. There's another present active, right? Лежащий, one who is lying. Какой-то другой человек, прячущийся под телегой, крадет его кольцо, right? You may not be able to see, but there's a guy hiding under the cart who's removing the ring from this dying or dead man, right? So we could say he's a человек, прячущийся, who is hiding. That's present active with the reflexive verb there, and he's stealing his ring. Okay, so that little text there, it's something I wrote, so I can't say, it's just somehow terribly authentic, but I do think that it reflects pretty well the frequency with which you can see deverbals in just ordinary Russian prose, right? They can be surprisingly common. Here, of course, I've tried to use a lot of different examples, so in that sense, it's maybe a little bit forced, but even here, I think it's really not too much of an exaggeration, right, in terms of, again, the frequency with which these deverbals are encountered, right? Again, people tend to say, well, they're very literary, they're very high style. Well, that's true, sort of, but it's not like they're reserved for just rare occasions. They're used everywhere in just ordinary Russian prose. And again, as we mentioned earlier, I think also to a surprising degree in Russian speech, right? I think, again, people often give or at least textbooks, classes, whatever, they sometimes give the impression that these would never be heard in spoken Russian. And I think the more spoken Russian you hear, you'll realize that that's just not true, right? Now, of course, it's a question of degree, right? But again, you shouldn't think that these are somehow forbidden, for use in everyday spoken Russian. Especially since a lot of these forms, we've seen examples have, may not necessarily be thought of as deverbals anymore. They may have really become, for example, adjectives or adverbs in their own right, and may be used actually all the time in speech, right? So it's kind of there's a lot to talk about here, but anyway, let's move on with present passive verbal adjectives. Okay, so present passive, right? So something which is, who or which is being, affected in some way, right? With this passive idea. And these are very easy to form. We're starting with our my form of the verb, right? Now, let's think for a moment, since we're calling these present passive, it stands to reason with present, right, that we're only going to use imperfective. So this first type of deverbal today, only imperfective, again, that's very logical. Okay, so for example, we take the мы form of that imperfective verb, читаем, строим, продаем, whatever that may be, and we simply add an adjectival ending, right? Читаемый, строимый, продаваемый. The only sort of weird instance here is with certain obstruents which add omы, for example, несомый, but those are, which is being carried, but those are really very unusual. So, these forms here are very straightforward. They're very easy to make. They're pretty easy to recognize, and so pretty easy to cover here. Again, note the translation, who or which is being whatevered, right? Read, built, sold, right? Again, that idea of passivity, and we could follow that by an instrumental to describe the tool or the means or the agent with which or by whom this activity is being carried out. For example, книга, читаемая студентами, очень интересная. The book which is being read by the students is very interesting, right? Now, of course, if we could also kind of paraphrase that in our translation by making it active, right? The book the students are reading. So let's create a few of these. Again, very easy. Получать, okay, получаем, получаемый, right? That which is received. Переводить, переводим, переводимый, right? Usually the stress will follow the infinitive. We didn't mention that. Переводимый, that which is being translated or transferred or led across. Ожидать, ожидаем, ожидаемый, that which is expected or being expected. Рекомендовать, рекомендуем, рекомендуемый, that which is recommended. Решать, решаем, решаемый, that which is being solved, like a problem or something. Решаемый, who or which is being solved. Обвиняемый. This would be a person, presumably, right, who is being accused or who is accused. And so обвиняемый, again, we've seen lots of examples of this. That could stand alone as if it were a noun to mean, the one who is accused or the accused or even the defendant, right? Someone who's being accused of something in court. Открывать, открываем, открываемый, which is being opened. Продавать, продаем. Okay, here again, we know by now that we have to watch out for avai verbs. This would be продаваемый, продаваемый, right? So in almost all of these deverbals, we've seen the avai doesn't kind of obey our step-by-step guidelines because the stem doesn't collapse. Okay, so let's fill in a few blanks. Again, we're just worried about agreement here. The apples sold at this market, or the apples which are sold, passive, at this market are very tasty. Яблоки, okay, plural, продаваемые. Продаваемые на этом рынке очень вкусные. Yesterday they arrested a man accused of murder, right? A man who is being accused of murder. Вчера арестовали человека. Okay, we've got человека, right? Animate accusative, which looks like genitive. So you want to say человека обвиняемого в убийстве. Okay, so that does it again for the present passives. And again, we won't be seeing those too often. Right? So file those away. It's important to have them on our radar, but they're the least common and also maybe the easiest to form. Okay, the next batch, these are so common that I've taken, after a former professor of mine, I've taken to calling these PPPs just kind of for short, because they'll be coming up all the time, and it's kind of a, the PPP, by the way, stands for past passive participle. I don't usually use the term participle, but in this case I will in this abbreviated form. Past passive participle, again, we would say in the book, past passive verbal adjectives, right? Adjectives from verbs that describe passive, right? Something has been done or was done to whatever in the past, right? Now, we're going to see three different basic endings we can add to whatever verb form to get a PPP, right? So there's sort of three subcategories of PPP, and we're going to take them one at a time. We're going to take the two easy ones today, and then a third one, which is a bit more difficult, tomorrow. Right now, how do we translate PPPs? This is pretty easy. They correspond to ED participles in English, right? So like arrested, we just saw earlier. To arrest, right? Arrested. Okay, everyone knows what that means. Okay, so the forms we're getting from our Russian PPPs are going to correspond to that. Now, keep in mind, of course, that a lot of English verbs have irregular participles, right, that don't end in ed, like stolen, bought, read, lost, right? There are tons of these, and of course any English speaker would just simply know them, right? But again, just in terms of general point of reference, be thinking ed or whatever the equivalent would be in English for those irregular forms. That's how we'll translate these. Okay, so let's start out with PPPs that end in only. Okay, so only is our first big ending. And pretty straightforwardly, we can say that verbs, any verb whose infinitive ends in ats, right, has that final a or ya, they're going to form their PPPs with this ending only. Okay, so in practice, this is pretty easy. Only thing to add is that the stress normally will jump back one syllable if it can, from where it is in the infinitive. So let's just look at this pattern. Прочитать, прочитанный. Right, we just drop the infinitive ending, we add ny, we end up with this only ending, and the stress typically jumps back one syllable, so we get прочитанный. Написать, написанный, right? Again, note the stress. Арестовать, арестованный, arrested. Потерять, потерянный. Okay, and it was, as with almost anything, right, there may be exceptions, but again, the stress rule is fairly reliable. Okay, so these are quite easy, right? Good news. So let's do a few. Сделать. Just quiz yourself on these. Сделанный. Okay, there, by the way, there's obviously nowhere for the stress to jump backwards too, right? So it's going to stay put here. Потерять. We had it already. Потерянный. Stress jumps back. Нарисовать. Нарисованный. Показать. Показанный. Назвать, названы, продать, проданы, проданы. Okay, so pretty easy to form these. How would we translate them? Number 1, done. 2, lost. 3, drawn. 4, shown. 5, named or called. And 6, sold. Okay, it's actually kind of surprising, right? Only one of those ended in ed, right? So again, as you all know very well, although you may not have thought about it, right, there are lots of irregular forms. And by the way, you think Russian's hard. English is no cakewalk either. So how would you like to learn all of those irregular verb forms there? As I often say, Russian verbs I think sometimes get a bit of a bad rap because they're, all things considered, they're fairly regular. Their patterns are generally pretty reliable, arguably more so than English. Okay, anyway. Okay, so PPPs, the next set of PPPs, right, number 2, they're going to end in t. Okay, so which verbs form PPPs like this? Okay, again, a pretty reliable guideline. Take the infinitive. If it's one syllable, okay, and the key is to ignore any prefixes. Now, at this point, we all know what prefixes are. We've seen, I think, all of them at this point. We all know what they look like. So look at the infinitive, ignore the prefix, and count how many syllables, if any, right, if there is a prefix. Count how many syllables are left. If your count is one syllable for the infinitive, chances are very good the PPP is going to be in t. Right, so look over a few of these. Zhать, спеть, взять, снять, all one syllable. Okay, now here are more examples with prefixes, right? Выжать, одеть, начать, понять. Okay, so we ignore the prefix. We see, okay, if we ignore the prefix, we're left with one syllable. Those are all going to take, they're going to form PPPs in t. The only exception to that, by the way, actually, we'll get to those in a moment. I got ahead of myself. Okay, so let's look over a few of these. Look at the infinitives. Разбить, помыть, снять, начать, одеть, согреть. Again, all of those, if we ignore prefixes, we're left with one syllable. So we simply drop the infinitive ending. We add ty. Разбитый, помытый, снятый, начатый. Kind of an exception there for the stress. The stress here is generally going to follow the infinitive. Одетый, согретый. Okay, now again, a few kind of unusual cases here. /r verbs, right? That non-syllabic root, they're kind of funny. From стереть, you get styor. It would be in the past tense, and we end up with stjorty. Okay, that's obviously kind of weird, but there aren't a whole lot of those verbs, by the way. Okay, finally, all verbs and nu verbs also will take t, but they wouldn't follow this syllable count rule, right? Because both of these verbs we're adding suffixes, each of which is a syllable. So if you add the or the nu, you're getting an extra. You're going to have at least 2 syllables in your infinitive. So they don't follow that general rule we gave. Okay, so расколотый, перевернутый, and we see their stress tends to jump back a syllable as well. Okay, finally, what are some exceptions, right? Are there any infinitives that, again, ignoring prefixes, they have only one syllable that don't take t? Yeah, the big exception would be, a couple of irregular verbs and then NSA verbs, right? So again, just think of these as exceptions. Of course, again, at the end of the day, there aren't that many of them. So, for example, dać, which is irregular, would give данный. Okay, that's an irregular verb. Of course, its infinitive doesn't end in ать. Собрать, назвать. Okay, so if we ignore the prefixes, we would be left with брать, звать, one syllable. But again, these are NSA verbs, so they don't follow this rule. Of course, the reason is that their roots are non-syllabic, and they've had an added to create the infinitive, right? So it's kind of I don't know what to call it, an optical illusion or something, that they don't actually follow this pattern, even though they happen to look like it. Okay, so for whatever, we get собранный, названный. Again, the stress jumping back, as we learned just a moment ago. We learned that typically happens with PPPs in anly. Okay, so let's form a few of these. Okay, so these are all going to take t, so I've kind of told you these are all going to take t, but again, you may look them over and count syllables and try to think, how might you guess that? Okay, but again, these are pretty easy to form actually. Vypity, right? I mean drunk, right? Not one who is drunk, but like something that has been drunk, right? The coffee had been drunk or something. Взять, взятый, taken. Сжать, we'd get сжатый, squeezed. Раздеть, раздетый, undressed. Начать, начатый, stress jumps back. Begun, вышить, вышитый, embroidered. Убить, убитый, killed. Подогреть, подогретый, right, heated up. Забыть, to forget. Забытый, forgotten. Выжать, to squeeze out. Выжатый, squeezed out. Спеть, спетый, sung, right, like the song has been sung. And finally, открыть, открытый. Okay, let's fill in a few blanks again. You've probably noticed all these verbal adjectives are, of course, adjectives. So when we're filling them into a sentence, we're just looking for agreement, right, with whatever noun is modified. Здесь продают свежевыжатый апельсиновый сок, right? A сок is our direct object here, masculine, so that's easy. Выжатый апельсиновый сок. 14, a pigeon flew into the open window. Opened, we could say literally, even though we wouldn't normally say that in English. Открытое окно, right? Голубь влетел в открытое окно, into the opened window, right? The window that has been opened. 15, we saw a well-dressed woman in the theater. Мы видели хорошо одетую женщину в театре. Right? Одетую женщину. Okay, you may notice from these examples that, again, as with any of these participles, they could open up a participial clause, right, with a comma, or they could also, they're adjectives, right, so they could come before a noun simply and just modify it. And I think that's what we have in all three of these examples, right? Squeezed juice, opened or open window, and clothed or dressed woman. Okay, now let's now jumble these up, right, and try to spot which of these will take only and which ты. Okay, потерять. Okay, that's going to be only, right? Hopefully the reason is obvious. Потерянный, lost. Закрыть, that's going to be ты. Закрытый, closed. Принять, принятый, принятый. Right, stress jumps back there. Again, I think that's somewhat exceptional. Нарезать, нарезанный, sliced, вынуть, вынутый, taken out, изобрать, избранный, избранный. Right, брать is an NSA verb, as you may recall. Избранный, elected. Okay, so let's one more thing quickly to cover today, I think, right, and this is very important. We've probably seen examples earlier in poems or whatever, and we mentioned it today. With passive participles, and in fact with any passive verbal construction, right, you get the instrumental case all the time, and that will tell by whom or with what the action was performed, right, in this passive sense. So let's just look at a few examples. Письмо, написанное ручкой. Okay, a letter written, okay, or which was written, PPP, написанное ручкой, with a pen. There's our instrumental. Or let's say the same thing, but now naming the agent, right, the person by whom this was done. Письмо, написанное студентом. Right, a letter written by a student, instrumental. Here are two examples from a Lermontov story that's kind of crazy, as you can imagine, based on these examples. Свинья, убитая шашкой. A pig killed with a saber. Right, that's your tool, your means, and now agent. Свинья, убитая пьяным казаком. Right, a pig killed by a drunken Cossack. Okay, now a quick painting. Let's look at this first. Mussorgsky, right, this is a portrait of the great composer, known for Boris Godunov, the opera, among other things. And Repin painted this portrait, I believe, like 3 days or 2 days or whatever before Mussorgsky died of alcoholism, essentially. as far as I know. Это известный портрет, написанный Репиным за несколько дней до смерти великого композитора. Okay, this is the famous portrait painted, right? Painted, PPP, by Repin several days or a few days before the death of the great composer. Картина написана маслом. The painting was painted with oils. Okay, so we have two instrumentals there. Can you spot them? Repinim, right? That's an agent, right? It was painted by Repin, instrumental, and it was painted with oil, or masla, by the way, can also mean butter or oil, like vegetable oil or whatever, and also oil paint, right? So maslam, painted with oil, meaning with oil paint. Okay, so write these same examples. Картина написанная маслом, a painting painted with oil, that's the means or the instrument or whatever. And a portrait написанный Repinim, right, painted by Repin with an agent in the instrumental. Okay, let's do a few translations. Again, pretty simple here, practicing PPPs. The student killed a fly. Okay, some of these will just be simple using verbs, right? But again, it's the, look at the variations here. Okay, that's an active sentence. Student убил муху. Okay, so what are some other things we could say about this? I see the fly killed by the student. Я вижу муху. Okay, now we're getting a prepositional, a verbal adjective, right? A participial phrase here. Я вижу муху убитую, right? Killed. Okay, by the student, that's going to be instrumental. Студентом. Я вижу муху убитую студентом. He killed it with a textbook. Okay, that's an active verb, right? We don't need anything fancy. Он убил ее учебником, right? With a textbook. Okay, so again, we know that we could also, of course, have instrumentals with active verbs, right? He killed it with a textbook, instrumental. Okay, number 2, my father wrote me a letter. Отец написал мне письмо, right? Отец написал письмо. Active sentence, active verb. I received a letter written by my father. Okay, я получил письмо. I received a letter. What kind of letter? Написанное отцом, or написанное моим отцом, right? Written by my father, instrumental. I received a letter written with a pencil. Я получил письмо, comma. Okay, what kind of letter? Написанное карандашом, right? Instrumental of means. Mom sliced the cutlets. Mama нарезала котлеты. We ate the cutlets sliced by mom. Мы съели котлеты. Okay, what kind of cutlets? Нарезанные мамой, right? Instrumental мамой. Finally, we ate the cutlets sliced with a knife. Мы съели котлеты, нарезанные ножом. Ножом there. Okay, that's it for today. So we've covered 2 of the 3 possible PPPs, right? Only and ты, and then we'll see a third ending tomorrow, yonly or inly. And as you might imagine, the added layer of difficulty with this third type of PPP is the issue of stress, right? Is it yonly or yenly? And how do we make that determination? Okay, so until tomorrow, до свидания.